Ebed, like in Hebrew, Ebed Yahweh, servant of Yahweh, the servant of God. Abd is, in Arabic, is Ebed in Hebrew. Abd is slave, servant of, Ebed, same. All Semitic languages basically are the same. Just variations on the vowels and a little bit of the consonants, but the words are more or less, just like French and Spanish and Italian, more or less, you know, all the words sound the same, slightly different accents and variations on the same thing. So this means servant of Allah. That's odd. I didn't think Allah was a big guy until Muhammad began to announce him. How come his father's already called a servant of Allah? How come his name embodies the whole idea of being a servant of God, of Allah? I always found that very strange. I don't know what the answer is. Unless it shows there's a tradition of this sort of activity in his family that's already going on for some time. It's not a new tradition with him. And there's an implication of that. To my mind, there's an implication of that with that name. Why else would he have a name like that unless it's not really his name and it was just made up? And then on to his mother is sort of Amina. Or I guess, is it Amina? How do you pronounce it?
Amina.
Yeah, it's Amina. The accent's over the A, huh? Yeah, it's a long, I always get that mixed up. But anyway, it actually means to believe, to be a believer. And there's another one that, I know it's his mother's name, but it just is too perfect. Or somewhat perfect that one wants to know what's actually going on. How come Abdullah is married to Amina? The servant of God is married to someone who's called a believer. It's just something more lurks beneath the surface there. I obviously can't go any further than that. Anyway, his father is said to have died before he was born. For some reason, somehow, I don't know what the details would be. And his mother dies when he basically around 6 years old. This is according to the biographies of the Prophet. That's why even in the Quran, the Prophet's very interested in orphans, the plight of widows and orphans. His mother was a widow, and he ultimately was an orphan. So he's always going on about to the widow be kind, to the orphan protect, and so on. Numerous surahs, there is that refrain in the surahs, which reflects something of his personal life, but not just his. If you look at the Old Testament, the Bible laws, you always see in Leviticus and those places concern for widows and orphans. And you can look at those books like Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and so on, and you'll see a similar refrain. So it isn't not necessarily just his experience, but also the experience of those books that preceded him in the Middle East and similar religious tradition that he is, if you like, plugging into or becoming part of. So I'm not sure if it just reflects his own life or if it also reflects the heritage of that concern in the previous literature that was already permeating this area. You'll have to make that decision yourself. In any case, he is an orphan. And that's what I mean. He comes under originally the protection of his grandfather, Abdul Muttalib. But then later on, when his grandfather dies, he comes under the protection of his uncle, Abu Talib. I think, funnily enough, Ali does not seem to be Abu Talib's first son. Ali is the son of Abu Talib, but Talib would be his first son, whoever Talib was. I don't have any information about Talib. Why are we making a fuss about Ali? Because ultimately, who does Ali become the hero of? Well, when the history finally unravels, as we shall proceed through it all, it unravels into Sunnis and Shiites to some extent, and that's what we're seeing in Iraq today. And the Shiites get their name from being called the Party of Ali, that they hold Ali to be the heroic figure after the Prophet par excellence. And they feel that Ali is the first teacher, the first imam. So Ali is always important to keep an eye on, and as I said, he's also the father of the Prophet's only living descendants. So that also would be an important thing to pay attention to even in Sunni Islam. The Prophet doesn't have any male descendants who survived that we know of. There were some people came forward, but they didn't survive. So in this situation, he is under the protection of his First his grandfather, then his uncle. And he is involved in the caravan trade. He does go north and south. He obviously went to Syria, down to Yemen. He's a well-traveled man. He's an experienced man. He's a man of affairs. The fact that he marries a wealthy widow later on shows that he's a successful man of affairs. He knows the world. He's not